All right, so the first question I had for you is, you've used a number of different outlets for communicating, especially on this topic of fighting back against anti-science, from the short form in tweets to the long form in books. So what was the tipping point for you in writing this particular book, which, after reading some of your others, which have been very personal, this one is more history meets statistics and economics and politics?
I think it was the fact that I'd seen it, the fact that I saw this being adopted by a major political party in the U.S. It was, in a sense, state-sanctioned anti-science aggression. And I said, this is different, right? I mean, because in the past, you never really thought of Republicans as anti-science, right? Lincoln started the National Academy of Sciences, Eisenhower started NASA, George W. Bush started PEPFAR. Now the fact that science and scientists were in the crosshairs and were being political targets, that I thought was unprecedented. And that is where I felt we had to draw a line in the sand. And then the other thing that drove me to do this was we weren't getting the backing of the scientific societies. They were pretty silent, and even the national academies are not very out there on this. And the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy is not saying so. It was the kind of same thing with Rachel. If I didn't speak up about it, who would? And I had the ear and the eyes of the country being on the cable news channels every day, and I thought, if nobody said, we can't just allow this to go without any kind of opposition, and that's what drove me to do it. I think one of the things I remember happening too when Trump in 2020 started downplaying the severity of COVID, he said it was the flu, or that the hospitalizations were catch-ups in elective surgery. I mean, I remember listening to this because I said, I know what this is. This is an anti-science disinformation campaign. And then back then I was doing it from my laptop at home, and you may not realize it, but my wife and the cat were on the other side of the laptop. And I remember Ann saying, and usually she's the one that kind of keeps me tethered, the one who, because I can be pretty free in my speech sometimes, and she's the one uncharacteristically said, you have to speak out about this if that's what you really think, and that was a big driver as well.
Well, so let's talk about one of the other platforms that you use for getting the message out, which is social media, which can be a tool and a terror. I've taken some amount of lumps on social media around advocacy of the HPV vaccine, everything from being requisite the calling of that I must be getting money from the pharmaceutical companies, so I'm a shill for their vaccines, inundation with false facts about injury, and then there were the times when I was told to drop my panties and go back into the kitchen. But that really pales in comparison to just the absolutely brutal harassment that you get. So I'd love to know both how you cope with that kind of harassment, because you're fairly optimistic and lighthearted in all of the interviews that you give. And beyond that, for the audience here, if anybody is interested in getting more involved in advocacy work, what kind of thick skin mechanisms do we need to develop?
Well, I'm reminded of the immortal words of Lady Gaga, who called social media the toilet of the internet, and I always remember that. And so the point is, my public engagement, to me, the social media may be the least impactful, and the one I'm ready to discard at any minute. I mean, for me, it's much more meaningful to write the books and the opinion pieces, both in scientific journals, and I have a new one coming out with the Los Angeles Times, or the cable news channels. Social media does have its uses, though, and I have 500,000 followers almost, so it does reach people. But under Elon Musk's new regime, or X or whatever it's called, it's just become this cesspool of trolls and bots, and we'll see how much longer it goes. So I would say, it's a good tool to have in your toolbox, but the one thing you don't want to do is, if you do public engagement, don't make that your only your only approach, because it will always disappoint you. It's not a very I don't think it's a very productive outlet. It was, I think, earlier on in the pandemic, much less so now. The other thing I would say about, especially if you're a young person involved in public engagement, have a discussion about it with your Office of Communication, and get a sense of what the ground rules are. Because if you're out there in the public eye enough, you will screw it up and you will get in trouble, I can promise you. And you don't want to be the first time you meet with your Office of Communication is because you did something wrong. You want to have that close working relationship and get a sense of what the parameters are, what would get them upset, what they're happy to do. They're in a tough position themselves, Offices of Communication, because remember, they have a different agenda. They're charged with protecting the reputation of the institution, and that's their job. And so in many respects, their job is to keep the institution out of the headlines, not in the headlines. And so they have a different mission. And yes, they're sympathetic to your social justice concerns and fighting anti-science, but it's not their most important. So you're going to have to, there's always a give and take. And so, and the relationship between scientists and physicians at academic health centers and its Office of Communications, the health of the relationship varies from institution to institution, but oftentimes it's, well, you're an academic, you're free to speak out on whatever you want, ... but don't screw this up and don't get the institution in trouble. And then you know, that's pretty chilling also. So you're doing this with the sort of Damocles over your head. But understand what the ground rules are. I think the other is that, you know, especially young people, not everybody wants to be out there and communicating to the public, and that's fine too. You know, it's only a few that really want to do this. Don't expect a lot of rewards for it from the academic health center. We haven't figured out a way to put that into your metrics yet. I mean, I get evaluated like everybody else, and I don't see patients anymore, but I, you know, get asked about my papers in high impact journals and my
Well,
grants, and
it's funny you bring that up.
And you know, nobody ever asked me about even the single author books I write. And so the message coming from the Office of Communication, or the leadership, is not only do we not think this is important, but we think it's a waste of time. And so and I think that's actually problematic too, because that vacuum is what's been allowed to be filled with all the craziness, right? And if
Well,
we're really going to get this back on track,
I've
we got to
graphed your productivity, actually. So this weekend, I spent some time looking over the 400-page CV that your colleague Douglas sent to me. And I wanted everybody to see just, even since the year 2000.
What the hell happened in 2018?
So in blue, we've got publication in scientific journals, grants, books, and book chapters. And I've put a star just on 2021, just for reference. But then we can add in the number of articles you wrote in the popular press. Okay, we're still using the same axis here. But then when you start to add in the number of invited lectures, which is, you know, another metric for faculty on the job market and going for promotions, still, even in the early 2000s, you know, you were doing 60 to 80 a year, but in the last few years, I think it's very apparent you didn't sleep. But now if we also add in the number of appearances that you've had in TV and radio, as well as the number of times you were quoted in the press. I mean, I'm a scientist, I had to graph this, right?
I love it. I want to get a copy of all this too.
I spent a lot of time counting, because look at that, in 2019 and 2020, you had over 1,000 appearances. And I've also put down on the timeline when various infectious diseases were, there were outbreaks of H1N1, then Ebola, Zika, measles in Texas, but then more recently SARS-CoV-2. So my question was going to be about how you get, how this kind of factors into your metrics. How do you make time for this? How do you sleep? And why do you do it?
Well, I do. First of all, I do sleep. If I don't get 7, 8 hours sleep a night, I'm a wreck. So I do sleep. The one thing I do that's a little bit, odd is I never take vacations. I have too much anxiety on vacation, so I never take vacations. And so I work 7 days a week, and I'm sure I'm not alone. So that's why when people think because I seem well adjusted that I should be invited on panels for work balance, life-work balance, and I refuse to go on any of them because it'd be totally fraudulent. And I'm very nice to the people in my lab and everything else. I don't expect them to work like me, and I totally encourage vacations and time with family. It's just I have a unique personality, but for me, I've created this very interesting life for myself with one foot, in the lab meetings and the labs and the papers, and I'm always revising a paper or working on a grant at any one time, and the writing and the public engagement, and I find the two oddly very reinforcing. And also, I think it gives me more credibility, the fact that, when I was on the cable news channels every day, I was one of the only scientists that was actually working on COVID, and I was working on a COVID vaccine. So I think that was also very interesting as well, as opposed to all the other talking heads, which also did a very good job, but they were generalists, right? They were basically docs. They were physicians trained in one specialty or another that, was learning on the fly. I'd been working on coronaviruses for 12 years, and so I had that experience.
All right, I think we can take the slide down, but segueing from something that you said right before, thinking about the culture shift within our professional societies and institutions in terms of being more aware of being politically neutral, and the likelihood that they are going to stay that way. And so therefore, as we as a populace trying to get more involved, where it is that this vacuum is that scientists have created about not stepping in and being heard and being vocal, that balance between being vocal versus being shameless self-promoter or grandstanding. And there's a line in the last paragraph of the book that I thought was very salient. The sad reality is that it is now apparent that outside groups are not coming to our rescue, and the scientific community must help itself. So this comes after your arguments that scientists can no longer remain silent. So is that your advice for this group of scientists that is listening, that we cannot and should not remain silent?
Well, I mean, to address the first point, we aren't really getting the backing that, in private, everyone is supportive from the scientific community. It's the lack of public support, so you kind of feel like you're on your own. I mean, Martin Luther King says, not that I'm comparing myself to Martin Luther King for a minute, but he says, it's not just the words of the enemies, it's the silence of the friends. That's the tough part. I mean, that's the thing I worry about the most. When Steve Bannon calls me a criminal, or Robert F. Kennedy Jr., or some virulent anti-vaxxer attacks me, it's like, yeah, okay, but it's what I more worry about are how are my colleagues thinking of all of this, and what the impact on my professional career as a scientist will be, and that's what we don't get the backing for, and I think we don't have that infrastructure in place. And I've had a number of conversations now with some of the senior staff of the White House and the National Academies about this, and hopefully there'll be some changes. But that is a lonely place that we are right now, and exactly how we can do that and feel more comfortable speaking out, it will require a culture shift. So it's not there. I wouldn't want people, especially young people, to go through what I've had to go to be such a public champion of science. It shouldn't be this hard. I think that's the longest, I don't know the answer to your question in a while.
All right, I have a question, but if people want to...
But by the way, things like this, these are great, right? I mean, at least the book is more hypothesis generating than hypothesis testing. It says, look, this is the problem. We've now had anti-science adopted at the highest levels of the US government. It's happened in the Bolsonaro regime in Brazil and Viktor Orban in Hungary. This has become a signature of authoritarianism globally, is targeting the science and scientists. It has historical precedent with Stalin and Vavilov and Lysenko. And at least it spells it out so we can begin chipping away at it. And Chipping away means I don't know that the health or scientific sectors even know what to do at this point. I mean, for instance, you see Vivek Murthy, our Surgeon General, is a very good Surgeon General. I think very highly of him. He's great. But on this issue, he stumbles because he can't talk about what I just talked about. He can't talk about, or feels he can't talk about Fox News and members of the House Freedom Caucus and Senator Johnson and Senator Paul. So what does he do? He kind of skirts around the edges and talks about the social media companies and how they have to be a little less viral in their algorithms. And sure, that's useful as well, but it's not getting to the 800-pound gorilla. So how do we begin doing that? And who takes this on if it isn't the health and scientific sector? Is it, do we bring in Homeland Security? Is it the Commerce Department, the Justice Department? I talk about the role of Russia in this. What Russia's been doing is flooding our computer with bots and trolls, which interestingly are both pro-vaccine and anti-vaccine, because Putin has something else in mind. They're they look at certain issues that are destabilizing democracies, including the United States. And guess what? Vaccines is a big one. So they're flooding it with pro and negative bots and trolls as a destabilizing mechanism. So what is the role of State Department in this? And same with, I met with Tedros at WHO. It's not, the WHO is not going to solve this. It's going to require all the UN agencies. We may need NATO involved. And I always bring it back to one point. This is not a theoretical or academic discussion. 200,000 Americans just died because of this. And that's why we need to care, is that this is causing loss of life on a large scale, and it's not self-correcting. I used to say when, with parents not vaccinating their kids, I'd say, well, there could be a measles epidemic in the community, word will get around that so-and-so's in the hospital or in the ICU, and then there's that self-correction mechanism. It's not happening with this. 200,000 Americans have just perished, and what you're seeing from the House, the GOP House and Senate is a doubling down. Rather than pause for self-reflection, or saying, no, it was the vaccines that killed Americans, COVID vaccines. And by the way, the scientists invented the virus, and now we're going to get them. And so they're doubling down on the attacks on scientists. So that's really troubling.
I have a last question, but if people want to start moving to the microphones or putting questions in the Q&A, we actually have signed copies of the book that we're happy to give to the first couple of people to ask questions. So my last question to you, you said that you would talk about it. I would love to ask you about RFK Jr. and the Joe Rogan experience. But the way that I want to ask that question is, do you ever consider engaging with them, or what happens when you are confronted by anti-vaxxers? I imagine you've probably gotten very good at responding to trolls.
I've engaged with them. In fact, I engaged with Robert F. Kennedy Jr. So what happened was he, in 2017, right before Trump was going to be inaugurated, he came out and said he was going to be appointed head of Vaccine Commission, which would have been a disaster, right? It would have been an anti-vaccine witch hunt. And I said, oh my God, what's going to happen? Then I remember my assistant, this was pre-Douglas, said, Dr. Hotez, I have Dr. Francis Collins and Dr. Anthony Fauci on the line. Can you talk to them? Well, yeah, sure. Okay, I'll talk to them. And what is it? Peter, we have a job for you. Okay, you have a daughter with autism. You can explain why vaccines don't cause autism. We want you to talk to Robert F. Kennedy Jr. And we arranged for someone to broker it. It would be a neutral party. I said, sure. And so I had a number of conversations with him and a number of email exchanges. It was very unproductive because it was the whack-a-mole, right? It was, first it was MMR, then it was thimerosal, then spacing vaccines, then it was chronic illness, and just all over the map. And you really, he was not in listening mode. He, clearly was not going to, there was no breakthroughs here, and it became an exercise in frustration for both of us. So, fast forward to earlier this year, I knew I was in trouble when Steve Bannon started trolling me. I said, because what happens is when there's a big wave of aggression against me, it comes in this very concentrated form. So in 2021. Laura Ingraham and Governor DeSantis, went after me saying that, because I'd predicted that the Delta wave was going to hit Florida very hard, and 2 weeks later it did. But before then, they were mocking me, saying I was just being an alarmist. And that's fun when Laura Ingraham and Governor Ron DeSantis go after you. And then the following year in 2022, on the day I was, co-nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize for our COVID vaccine work, Tucker Carlson was not going to let me have a good day, right? So it was, so he really went after me. And when that happens, it's a big wave of aggression that subsequently follows. That's when the Army of Patriots, all the online and in-person stalking, harassment. So then when Banner was going after me, I said, oh, I think we're in for another wave. And then you had Robert F. Kennedy Jr. go on Rogan and started going after me, saying the usual things, I'm a shill for industry, even though we'd found a way to bypass the pharma companies to do this. And then I tweeted, I think Anna Merlin's from Vice magazine, who talked about what RFK Jr. was saying about me, and I just retweeted it with some modest comment, but I think Joe Rogan was looking for a cause célèbre or a casus belli, and then he
Right.
went after me, and then Elon Musk glommed on. I mean, between RFK Jr. and Musk and Joe Rogan, that's just about every follower on Twitter who's not, except for Taylor Swift, right? So that was pretty formidable, and for the reasons I articulated, I wasn't going to debate him, and that was pretty tough. And then the stalkings really accelerated.